Good evening, everybody. Good to see you again. I guess we're pretty much ready to get started here. Does anyone have any questions about last week's class or just anything they've been pondering that you'd like to ask? Yeah. I'll just play the video up here. I'll just let it roll. Yeah. Good. So yeah, if you do have any questions, of course, just feel free to put your hand and blurt them out, or you can ask me later as well. So if we're looking at our kind of roadmap through the course, I mentioned last week was focused on kind of clearing the area of sort of misconceptions, misunderstandings of science, of math, of logic, of reason, of the rationality of faith, of belief. Okay, and so I kind of mentioned a couple of times the crux of everything we're talking about, the crux of all belief really comes at the moment of the origination of the universe. Like, did God make the universe or not? Because everything else sort of falls out after that, right? The nature of God and evolution on this planet and things of this nature, like these are all derived things, like, again, billions of years later. So what really matters is, did in that moment of the universe beginning, was that God or was that something else? And that's what we want to find out, because that's going to answer a lot of questions for us. And so we're beginning our investigation into the arguments for the existence of God and for essentially God as that originator. And as I kind of mentioned, the surprising thing about some of these arguments is how many there are. So we're going to go over 9 arguments in this class. And as I kind of mentioned, I mean, over time, more and more arguments are being developed to support this, right? Through, and again, we're going to look at some developed from science, from mathematics, from philosophy, from logic, okay? And some of them are pretty old. They go back 1,000 or more years, and some are very recent, within the last couple of decades, right? And so, if we think about people these days who are very skeptical, atheists or skeptics, or these kind of people, one thing I always wonder is, like, what are they looking at when they find there are no reasons for God? Because again, not only do we have so many reasons, it's not like someone just discovered them yesterday and okay, they haven't had time to find out about them. Like, some of these are really old and have been refined over centuries. So it really, I think, calls into question, like, what exactly are the skeptics looking at? And have they really gone through and debunked all of them? Or is there something else going on? I think, spoiler, I think really they're just looking for an excuse not to believe, in my personal opinion, but we're going to look into that. And one key thing to keep in mind is not just that there are so many arguments, but they're all independent. Okay, so the analogy here, this is not links in a chain, right? Where this one is true, and only if that one's true can this one be true. And if we break the weakest link, everything goes away. That's not the analogy. The analogy would be more like not links in a chain, but like chain mail armor. Okay, every chain in chain mail armor reinforces the whole. Okay, so these are all independent arguments that together make, I think, the case just incredibly strong. Another way to look at it is, if you think of a court of law, rarely, I think, would a lawyer go to the court of law and say, Your Honor, we have, one piece of paper we found with some writing on it that's our whole case. Okay, that's maybe a hard case to win, right? But if they say, look, Your Honor, we have, DNA evidence, eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage, GPS tracking coordinates, phone records, okay? Now, even if somehow the judge strikes down one line of evidence or the jury doesn't buy it, they've got 4, 5, 6 other lines of evidence, right? And that's what we're doing here. Is that a question or? Oh, sorry. I thought you. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay. Awesome. No, it's fine. Yeah. Right. And so, yeah. So so even if you're talking to someone and they so you gave them 9 arguments, and maybe they say, well, I don't like that one. I don't like that. I don't buy it. You're like, okay, what about the other 7? Right? They'd have to basically disbelieve all 9. And maybe by that, maybe there'll be more tomorrow. Who knows? Like I say, we keep getting more. But it's not enough for someone to just pick apart one they don't like, because these are independent arguments. Okay, so again, some people, maybe the way their mind works, they like some arguments more than others, but that's fine, right? Again, we think of Paul's suggestion in the New Testament: we become all things to all people, we might win some to Christ, right? So for the scientifically minded, we have science-based arguments. For the mathematically minded, we have mathematical arguments. For the philosophers, we have philosophical arguments, and on, okay? So The first one we're going to look at is actually 5. We have 5 for the price of 1 for the first argument here. These are the 5 ways of Aquinas. Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas, what is a Catholic Aquinas. He was a Catholic theologian in the Middle Ages, so going back quite a ways now. And so when I went to university, I was just brand new student and was not there even very long. And I was rummaging in the used bookstore, and I found a book of philosophy. It was a couple bucks, and I thought, okay, I'll buy it. And I encountered the 5 ways of Aquinas. This is the first time I ever encountered any suggestion that there were arguments for the existence of God. And I think, right, if you go talk to someone who doesn't believe in God, or maybe some people even who do, and say, like, what are the arguments for the existence of God? They probably think there aren't any. I think this would be the sort of the common wisdom, is that there are no arguments, right? We just have blind faith, right? But actually, that's not the case. And again, these arguments are from the Middle Ages. This is, ancient wisdom, okay? So we've had arguments for the existence of God for a long time, and we're going to go through some of them now. So the first one, Aquinas said, is the argument from motion. And this is what he said. If we look around the world, we see that some things are in motion and some things are at rest. And these days, we have a little more of a sophisticated scientific understanding. We can phrase this a little bit differently and say, things that are moving have kinetic energy. And if they're at rest, they don't have kinetic energy, right? Things that are very high up have high potential gravitational energy. Things that are low have low gravitational potential energy. A hot cup of water has high thermal energy. A cold cup of water has low thermal energy, okay? So we see these things in the world. But we also see that, the boulder rolling down the hill has high kinetic energy, but it didn't roll itself. The kinetic energy it gained was from something pushing it, right? The hot cup of water did not gain thermal energy on its own. Something heated it up. It gave it thermal energy. Something, like lifted off the ground to gain high potential energy, again, did not lift itself. Something lifted it, okay? So everything, when you think about things that are moving or this energy transfer, it's always something is moving something else. Something is energizing something else to perform this motion, this energy transfer. And we said, okay, let's think about this. Let's think of a steam engine. Okay, we're burning oil, let's say, okay, and then the heat from the burning oil heats the water. And the water, boils, and that thermal energy transfers into steam, and the steam rises, and that turns a turbine, causes sort of the mechanical energy to go. That creates electrical energy, and that's how we turn on a light bulb. I mean, we don't use steam engines anymore, but you get the idea, right? There's energy transfer through all these different sort of states of matter and through all these sort of different steps. But you can trace that back even farther, right? The energy didn't begin with that little oil you burned, whatever, right? The oil came from something, and that came from something, and that gave that energy, and that moved that, right? And you can kind of see this chain beginning to form, and you can trace it back and back and back and back and back. And if you go far enough back, you're going to find one of two things is true. Either you go back infinitely because there is no beginning and the universe is infinite, or you come to a first mover, was what Aquinas said, right? Something that began this chain of movement, of energy transfer. Now, Aquinas, believing that God created the world, did not believe that the universe was infinite. He believed it had a beginning. At the time, this was kind of controversial, because people did believe the universe was infinite and it had no beginning. And this was not, nowadays, of course, we again take this sort of for granted in sort of our understanding, but the idea of the beginning of a Big Bang did not enter sort of scientific understanding until like the 1950s, right? So for centuries, millennia, people thought the universe had no beginning. Okay, so back then this was sort of controversial. But he said, look, as a Christian, he thought, okay, you can't go back forever infinitely. The universe, it doesn't go infinitely. We reject that. So there must be a first mover. Okay, so, and he called this either the first mover or the unmoved mover. Okay, some force that can move the first thing in the chain, can energize the first thing in that chain without itself being moved, without itself receiving energy. And he said, well, what can do that? What is this force? I don't know, right? And so essentially, he's sort of, a little bit, obviously he has in mind, of course, he's trying to prove God. But just for the sake of argument, he says, what is this thing? We don't have a name for it. So this force, the unmoved mover, the first mover, what is this force? We got to call it something. We'll call it God. Okay. So now we gotta be very careful what he did. He didn't say, as we all know, God has the ability to, move things without being moved. And therefore, obviously, he started it, right? That would be sort of arguing from God backwards. But we're building this class from the ground up. So we're taking nothing on assumption. We don't assume God exists. So all he says is, we look at reality, we see this chain of motion of energy going backward, we arrive at a physical necessity, a physical requirement of a first mover. So some force must exist, just some force, nothing about God, nothing sort of divine, right? Just some force must exist that is able to sort of cause energy transfer, cause motion without itself being moved. And since we just need a name for it, we will call this force God. Okay. And so now we've sort of built one attribute of God, being able to sort of cause energy transfer, cause motion, put things into motion without sort of himself or itself being moved. Does that make any sense? Any questions about that? Kind of makes some sense, hopefully. Okay. So this is sort of, St. Thomas Aquinas starting to build up the understanding of the need for God. If you just examine the physical universe, right? Like, we have not talked about any verse of the Bible here. There's no verse of the Bible brought into this. It's just looking at our physical universe and understanding how energy works, how motion works, right? The second one is going to be very similar, and is the argument from causality. Causality. So again, let's think of our steam engine, okay? So we have this electricity. Well, the electricity is caused by, the turbine spinning. The turbine spinning is caused by the steam rising. The steam rising is caused by the water boiling. The water boiling is caused by the oil burning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we trace this back, right? Something, we don't perceive something to be able to cause itself to happen, right? We don't really have any understanding of that happening in our physical universe, right? Things are always cause and effect. So we trace this chain of causality back, just like we trace the chain of motion, of energy. And again, we go back and back and back and back and back until we either again come to an infinite universe or find something that is able to cause things to happen without itself being caused. Right. So again, Aquinas said this is the uncaused cause or the first cause, right? So again, very similar sort of construction to the argument from motion. But again, we kind of gained another attribute of, and again, so Aquinas said this thing, whatever this force is, we call God, right? So we now kind of gained a second attribute of God, right? God can cause things to happen without having any cause of himself, right? So hopefully you can see very, very similar, but I think sort of equally compelling looking at it from a different angle. Any questions about that one? Good, okay. This one's gonna be very similar. And then we're gonna kind of, after this, go to some that are a little bit different, but this is the argument from contingency. So if you remember, last week we talked a little bit about contingency and necessity. So a contingent being or a contingent thing is something that exists, but needn't have existed, and maybe will cease to exist someday. So basically everything we can even fathom is contingent, right? We are all contingent. This building is contingent. These chairs are contingent. The whiteboard's contingent. There's a time when it didn't exist. Now it exists, and there will be a time when it will cease to exist. Okay. So myself as an example, right? I'm a contingent being because my parents gave birth to me, or my mom at least, right? And similarly, my mom was a contingent being because her mother gave birth to her, and her mother gave birth to her. And again, we see this again chain of contingent beings being brought into existence by virtue of other contingent beings. Well, again, let's trace it back, right? Contingent being, contingent being, contingent being. Again, eventually, if you go far enough back, you're going to find a place where no contingent beings have yet come into existence. So if nothing contingent yet exists, there's nothing to bring contingent beings into existence, unless you have something whose being is not contingent at all, but necessary. Like we learned last week about the different styles of truth, right? There's necessary truth, contingent truth. So this being is not contingent. It had no beginning. It was impossible for it not to exist. Okay, so not just that it exists, it couldn't not have existed. It must have existed. And again, this thing we call God, right? So again, this force, okay, that we're building these attributes for, can affect motion, energy, can bring things into existence, can cause things, and yeah, sorry, can bring things into existence without itself being brought into existence. So this force that we're calling God, its existence is described by the nature of its own being, right? The nature of its being is somehow such that it must exist. It has always existed, it must have existed, and it could be no other way. And if it wasn't for that fact, then no contingent things would exist at all, and there would just be nothingness. Any questions about that one? Argument from contingency.
Not a lot of difference between 2 and 3.
Not a ton, yeah. So
Aquinas needed 5 points.
yeah. I mean, in some ways, he could have kind of combined all these into 3, or yeah, maybe 4, but I don't know, maybe it didn't quite have the same snappy ring to it. The 4 ways of Aquinas, I don't know. So the last 2 are a bit different. So I want to take a little just kind of sidebar here, and we're gonna make a little kind of little sidebar thing, because I want to talk about the fact that, you know, when he developed these, and actually, I mean, a lot of these were actually even predated him, like Aristotle and some of the Greek philosophers, they thought about these things too. So again, this is going back, you know, quite a ways. But at the time, as I mentioned, people did not believe the universe had a beginning. So some people just dismiss these because of that. They're saying, you know, he's saying there must have been a beginning. People say, I don't believe in a beginning. The universe is infinite. Nowadays, though, we know that's not true. And one basic, or my favorite way, there's a couple different ways that we know that scientifically. My favorite way is called the heat death of the universe. Okay? So, heat death of the universe. So let's take a quick detour here and let us examine the second law of thermodynamics. So there is a thermodynamic concept called entropy. Okay, entropy, very roughly stated, is sort of the measure of randomness in a system at the molecular level. Okay, so how random the particles are kind of moving around. And the second law of thermodynamics says that in any sort of natural system, like say our universe, entropy always increases over time, always. Okay, it's the only thing in nature that has sort of a direction to it. So like, for example, if I had, again, a cup of water and I boil it and condense it and boil and condense and boil and condense, and somehow I gave you like a snapshot of the molecular level of both states, water and gas, and told you like which one came first, the water vapor or the water liquid water, you wouldn't know, except if you examined the entropy, because whichever one had higher entropy would mean that one came second. We can see that sort of direction. Okay, so if the entropy goes up, that one happens later. It's the only thing in nature that has this sort of, we call it sort of a temporal aspect to it, time-related aspect, always increases. Otherwise, boiling and condensing water is purely reversible, except for this one thing. There you go. You cracked it. Yeah, here you go. And so, if entropy always increases, what would happen if the universe was infinite, if it had no beginning? Well, by now, by this moment, an infinite amount of time would have passed, which means if entropy is always increasing, then right now, entropy would be maximized. It couldn't get any higher. And that is something called the heat death of the universe. Basically, it's meaning heat is not quite, it doesn't necessarily just mean like how hot temperature-wise, but heat is sort of just a easier way, instead of saying like, you know, the thermodynamic death of the universe, like, you know, what is thermodynamic? You know, it's the heat. You know, it's just a little easier way to think of it. But the point being, everything is so randomized, entropy is so maximized, there's not enough energy in the universe to force these particles to do anything, right? So there's no useful sort of work, useful anything left in the universe. Well, we don't live that, right? That, you know, the stars are still burning, we're still doing stuff. Like, we are not currently experiencing the heat death of the universe. So we know that the universe had a beginning. And so now that's great, because now with all these ways of Aquinas, we have a much stronger understanding that he was kind of onto something, because he concluded either the universe is infinite or it had, the first mover, the first cause. So now we can exclude the possibility of the infinite universe. And just as one last kind of interesting bit about that, so kind of the sort of main sort of scientist that was sort of thinking about the beginnings of a universe was a guy named Georges Lemaitre. This is back in like sort of the 1920s, 30s, okay? He was, in addition to just a brilliant physicist and cosmologist and mathematician, he was a Belgian priest of the Catholic Church. So he was just, in between his duties as a priest, he was just delving into the, origins of the universe. And he came to understand that the universe probably had a beginning. And the thing is, no one believed him, right? Einstein often would argue against him. It's, very famously, Fred Hoyle, the scientist, was on the BBC radio saying, oh yeah, sure, there was just a big bang and everything came into existence. Okay, so now we have a bit of a revisionist history now, because when he said big bang, he was mocking Georges Lemaitre, a Christian scientist, for proving the universe had a beginning, right? But of course now it's somehow held up as this paragon of atheist scientists to disprove God, right? Which is very revisionist history, because that's not at all what it ever was. Originally, it was atheists mocking Georges Lemaitre, a Christian, for coming up with this idea, okay? And now eventually everyone came to understand. They're like, okay, I guess he knows what he's talking about, right? And so he won the Nobel Prize, a couple of them, for his work. But again, I think it's just interesting to think about, right? These ideas, again, of science keep undergirding, reinforcing our faith. And this idea that somehow faith and science should be in opposition to each other is just not true, right? Again, we see these amazing, Christian scientific minds doing all this amazing work, and there's no conflict at all, right? For them, it's they're doing it, sort of exploring in their faith, right? So yeah, Georges Lemaitre, yeah, Big Bang Theory, heat death of the universe, pretty interesting stuff. Any questions about any of that? All good. Okay. These next two are going to be a little bit different and sort of less scientific, more philosophical. We're going to call this one the argument from degrees of quality. And so what Aquinas said is, if we look around the world, we see that some things are good and some things are bad. We look at ourselves and there are some good things about us, some bad things, some noble things, some shameful things, right? And we see that, we as a society, we say like, this is the kind of life you should live, it's good. This kind of life is not as good. This kind of life is even worse, right? And he said, well, we can start to kind of order this, right? We understand, like, the reason we can say that this part of me is good or this part of me is bad is because we're evaluating it against a standard, right? If there was no standard, we couldn't evaluate, right? The only reason we can order the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, because we have a rule for how they are organized, right? For how they're standardized. And he said, so if you want to say that this is good, what you basically are saying is because how emblematic, how near it is to the standard of goodness. And so he says, this shows that there is some ultimate standard of goodness. And this thing we call God, Aquinas said, right? Now, this one gets a little kind of wishy-washy, maybe in the sense that some people don't agree about how we order things, right? So, there are some people who've said to me that, animal rights are more important than human rights. So if someone were to say, like, as sort of Aquinas said, well, it's better to be, like living than dead, better to be an animal than a plant, better to be a human than an animal. Like he's got kind of some ordering of sort of beingness. Some people might say, no, I disagree. It's better to be, first of all, it's better to be dead than alive, because being alive is like a burden. You've seen some people like try to, bring their parents to court for having them these days, right? This is a thing some people do. They say it's, it's unfair to be born to live. Or they'll say, yeah, animal rights are, better than human rights, so you got your ordering wrong. So some people will kind of push back on the particulars. But again, if you notice, though, what are they doing? They're still saying there is an ordering, right? There is a standard. You've just got it a little bit wrong. And this is why sometimes we need to, people love the whatabouts. Okay, what I mean by that is they'll say, well, look, the argument for motion, there must be a first mover. And they'll be like, yeah, what about slavery? They're like, whoa, we'll get there, but a lot of times people are so shocked by the conclusion, which is not very hard to understand, right? These are fairly simple conclusions, but they're so shocked by the implications of it that they immediately try to just, again, by malice or just by just sort of being up on their heels, will throw the whatabouts at you. What about slavery? What about the contradictions in the Bible? What about this? What about that? Just to, try to kind of get the conversation to go all over the place, right? So you'll, maybe say the degrees of quality, and they'll be like, what about animal rights? And again, it's like, okay, hold on, okay, fine. And then you can say, okay, all right, fine. Animals are more important than humans, right? But we still have an ordering, right? So again, you have to be a little bit careful not to go down these rabbit trails of people. They love to, bring the conversation everywhere. So whenever you're talking to someone, you got to go very slow, very methodical, and just stay on track, okay? But yeah, so basically this is what Aquinas concluded, right? The very fact that we can do an ordering implies a standard of goodness. And this standard we call God. So again, we've sort of built the sort of fourth attribute of God. And this is going to come up again later in a different proof as well. So kind of bear in mind this idea of ordering things to arrive at some standard. But any questions about that one? The argument from degrees of quality. All good. Okay, last one of Aquinas. This is maybe the weirdest one of the bunch, but argument from directedness. So again, what Aquinas was saying was things in nature seem to be directed towards some end. So if you imagine you have a tomato seed, you plant it in the ground, it becomes a tomato plant. It never becomes an oak tree. It never becomes a whale. It always becomes a tomato plant. Well, why? What has directed it towards that end? And this was a thing that the Greek philosophers like Aristotle thought about a lot. And they had a word for it, and they called it telos. And telos is sort of like the ultimate end state of something. The thing that, the state that things are inexorably moving towards through some sort of directed fashion. They had a whole way of thinking about it called teleology. Okay, teleology. This idea that, yes, everything is directed towards some end. And so Aquinas said, well, who directed it? The tomato seed does not choose what it becomes. It does not direct itself. Something has directed it. Something has ordained it to be a tomato plant. And he said, this thing we call God. Okay? So, a bit of a far cry maybe from some of these ones, which are much more derived from sort of a physical examination of the universe. This one is much more philosophical, right? And these days, probably people would say, well, that's not how biology works. Okay, that's not how genetic works. That's not how evolution works. Aquinas just didn't understand. And I would almost agree with that criticism if it weren't for the fact that in evolutionary biology, they kept using language that sounded like teleology to describe how animals and populations behave. And they didn't like it because it reminded them of this teleology, which, doesn't explicitly say there's a God, but heavily suggests it. And so they didn't like it. And so what they did was they couldn't get away from the language. So they just made their own word, and they call it teleonomy. Okay. It's the exact same thing, just without the historical baggage of teleology sort of implying God. So when they talk about, the populations of animals and their behaviors, they still use language that sounds like directedness, but they just call it teleonomy. And they've just sidestepped that word. So if it wasn't for the fact that they felt they had to make their own word to explain this phenomenon, I would probably say, yeah, maybe this one doesn't make sense anymore these days. But again, I don't know how else, the fact that evolutionary biologists felt they had to make their own word to sidestep this idea of God is pretty telling, I think. Again, I know make of that what you will. I'm not necessarily, again, none of these, right, are like ironclad proofs of God in like the strength of a mathematical proof, right? I think, as I mentioned last week, if we had anything like that, that'd be a very weak God. If we could explain him completely within the rules of our system. So I'm not saying the argument from directedness is, again, the silver bullet, boom, ironclad proof of the existence of God. But it's kind of just another sort of link in our little chainmail armor that makes you think, yeah, interesting. Evolutionary biologists are still using this language, these words, right? Okay, we're going to move on to the next one. But any questions about any of this before I erase it?
Ryan, so when did Thomas Aquinas exist?
Oh boy.
Plus or minus 300 years.
Oh sure, like
Middle Age.
yeah, Middle Age is like 1200 plus or minus 300.
How was he viewed by his contemporaries and maybe since then? Like, this is heavily relied on.
So in the Catholic Church, they are obsessed with this guy. They to this day, they love him. Like in terms of their sort of like Catholic theology, he is like number one. Okay. So he's held in extremely high regard in the Catholic Church. I think at the time, people had mixed opinions. One, because he, again, assumed that the universe had a beginning or concluded the universe had a beginning. Number two, because, again, for better or worse, he borrowed a lot from like Aristotle, who thought about this, thought about these kind of ones. So some people just said, oh, well, he's just regurgitating Aristotle, which, again, you'll sometimes find this argument, right, where there's a lot of fallacies people may use when they try to describe something in logical terms, right? But certainly, this idea that like, well, it can't be true because he's just regurgitating Aristotle. Well, that's not a valid criticism. Just because he was referencing, thought done by someone else doesn't make him wrong, right? But I think there is, again, in the effort to discredit him, to dismiss his findings, this was one sort of like scapegoat. Well, he's just another Aristotle, right? We can dismiss him. But of course, then they just don't actually go and think about what Aristotle said. They just dismiss it, right?
Generally, it's survived the test of time.
Yes, certainly these ones for sure, I would say. These ones a bit less just because they're a little more philosophical and people have, different opinions about some of that. But I think, yeah, for sure. I think they've survived the test of time. Absolutely, yeah. Okay. We're going to do next the Kalam cosmological argument. If you are at all familiar with Dr. William Lane Craig, who is a very prolific Christian philosopher and speaker, this is his favorite argument. Kalam cosmological argument. Okay. Oh, sorry, I realized for the sake of our Zoom viewers, I was going to do something here. Try that one. See if that helps. Okay. Okay. Kalam cosmological argument. Okay. So this one was developed actually by Islamic scholars, again, going back to the Middle Ages. And it's very, very, very simple. And it uses sort of a form of the propositional logic that we were looking at last week. So it goes like this. Premise one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Begins to exist as a cause. And I'm going to underline begins to exist because this is going to come up in a second. As a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist conclusion, the universe has a cause. As a cause. So again, if we're looking at it, sort of the symbolic logic of the propositional logic, we'd say something like, if begins to exist, then has a cause. or I'll put maybe like begins, I'll put a U. So like the universe begins to exist. The universe, in fact, did begin to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause. So this kind of structuring, where it's like, if something, and yeah, we know something, and we conclude the other thing. This is often called a syllogism in logic, a syllogism, where there's like sort of what they call a major premise. So everything that begins to exist has a cause, major premise. The minor premise of a sort of a specific example. Okay, well, the universe began to exist. In the conclusion, the universe has a cause. So I hope we can see that in terms of the logic involved here, it basically can't get simpler, right? We have two premises, one conclusion. The logic is what we call very valid. There's no logical errors here. It used one single rule of logic, where if we have this if-then form, and the first thing is true, the second thing is true. So the universe has a cause. Now, pretty simple. But of course, the implications, right, is that, yes, if the universe came into existence, then something caused that to happen, okay? Which, depending on who you talk to, again, they may disagree. Because if you say something caused it to happen, of course, then the next question is, well, who caused it to happen, right? And now people who sort of don't believe in God have some explaining to do. Before I start to dissect this a little bit, does anyone have any sort of questions about how the sort of logical form works or anything? That all good? Okay. So again, this one, the universe began to exist, I think basically is well understood in science these days. We sort of were talking about the second law of thermodynamics, things of that nature. Pretty much no one believes that the universe did not begin to exist. So I think we can sort of avoid that one. Or, we sort of all understand that. Now, this one is interesting. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. And so some people, again, whether by malice or just shock or ignorance, I'm not sure, will misstate the premise. And they'll say, oh, you say everything that exists has a cause. You say God exists, what caused God? And they will think this is so brilliant, a brilliant retort. So brilliant, Richard Dawkins wrote a book about it called The God Delusion, basically premised on a misreading of this sentence. Okay, but we're not saying everything that exists has a cause. We're saying everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if you'll notice, we just had Aquinas' third argument, third way, that we require something that necessarily exists, that does not begin to exist, that has always existed. So God is excluded from this first premise, because we don't consider God to be a force or whatever that begins to exist at all, but in fact is necessary. So this God would not fall into this this sort of syllogistic logic. But you'll get that pushback, right? Yeah, which is strange for another reason too. So number one, it's strange that Richard Dawkins wrote a whole book about what caused God, and millions of people think this to be, again, just a brilliant retort, as if in thousands of years no one else has ever asked this. Okay, so very, very strange. And the other strange thing about it is, I found in my experience, if you talk to someone about the ways of Aquinas, which are basically sort of saying, what happened before the Big Bang is sort of what Aquinas is getting at, right? If you go back, okay, fine, you say the Big Bang started things, so what happened to cause that? Which is, again, kind of what this is talking about too. The response I often get is like, well, that's a stupid question. Why do Christians always ask that question, right? Which is not a stupid question at all. It's a very, very important question. But it's sort of the other angle on this weird criticism of this logic, right? Because again, this is such a simple construction that where do you hang your hat, as it were, on a disagreement? Well, partly people do it by just sort of misreading it or mocking it. Okay, so they sort of misread the premise or just say, that's a stupid question, I'm not going to answer you. Okay, but let's maybe go a little step further and think about someone who really does think about this beyond that. So we say, okay, well, someone will say, well, sure, the universe began to exist. It caused itself. Yeah, it began to exist and it caused itself, they'll say. Now, first of all, I mean, this really defies logic because we don't really conceive of things causing themselves to happen, right? There's no logical or scientific or philosophical even understanding of what that would even mean, something to cause itself. But what they'll sometimes say is, well, you know, in quantum mechanics, stuff pops into existence all the time, okay? So now again, this is a very erroneous way of thinking for a couple reasons. Number one, just because things appear to pop into existence in quantum mechanics doesn't mean they don't have a cause. It just means that we don't understand it. So this, you know, there's sort of a common criticism of faith called the God of the gaps. This idea that we only believe in God because there are things we can't explain. So, you know, a long time ago, people didn't understand what caused thunder. They said, must be God. They don't know what caused the sunrises. Must be God. And as science advanced, that gap in our knowledge closed. And so the space for God closed. This is called God of the gaps. That the idea that as these gaps in our knowledge are closing, the space for God is closing. Of course, we don't conceive to have a God of the gaps. Like I said, as science advances, the evidence for God increases. But this kind of thing about quantum mechanics, I like to call it science of the gaps, right? We don't know how quantum mechanics pops things into existence. And so then we just say like, well, by science, or it kind of just becomes this weird hand wavy magic. And I'm not the only one to think that. There is one of these, certainly the most famous scientist alive. His name is Roger Penrose, who has done, for 50 years has been doing work in cosmology and mathematical physics. He is a research partner of the late Stephen Hawking times, okay? And in 2016, he wrote a book, and I'll write it on the board here because it's very interesting. It is called, I wrote it down here, it is called Fashion, Faith and Fantasy. Faith and Fantasy in the New Physics of the Universe. Of the universe, okay? And so this guy's not a Christian, okay? Roger Penrose. Sir Roger Penrose, officially, because he's been knighted, but anyway. And what he basically says is like, all these appeals to quantum mechanics that have no, that are not falsifiable, in the sense that there are no experiments for them that could ever show they're true or false, no empirical data. He says this is all nonsense, right? And so Stephen Hawking, again, his sometimes research partner, wrote a book called The Grand Design. And among other things said in it that because there is such a thing as the law of gravity, the universe can and will, meaning like inexorably, can and will create itself out of nothing. Okay, this is Stephen Hawking concluded, and basically concluding that there's no such thing as God, no need for God, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. So now, first of all, again, so he's basing this on sort of an even more bizarre variant of quantum mechanics called M theory, which again, there's no data for, no external data. In this book, Roger Penrose just eviscerates it. Okay, but this is kind of what I mean again about the science of the gaps, right? So I don't believe in God, but I need something to explain it. So we'll just sort of be like hand wavy science, right? But no, we don't ascribe magical powers to science. So this is a really bad analogy to just be like, it just somehow works. And let's not ask questions about it. Let's not, we don't have any experiments. That's fine. Let's just believe it. Again, this is not science. Okay. And again, Roger Penrose just destroys it in this book. But again, we can think about this. Okay, so because there's such a thing as the law of gravity, the universe will create itself out of nothing. Wait a minute, if there's nothing, then how is there a law of gravity? Right? There should be nothing, right? The law of gravity does not predate the physical universe, right? The laws of physics came into existence with the universe. And to answer that, we have to understand that when a lot of times some of these physicists talk about nothing, they don't mean nothing. Okay, there's a physicist named Lawrence Krauss who he says, yes, the universe came out of nothing. And you ask him, well, what is nothing? Oh, well, nothing is a roiling sea of energy and quantum possibility. It's like, well, that's not nothing then, right? And there's a very interesting discussion that was held a while back. Sort of, it was a panel discussion with Lawrence Krauss. I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, another scientist, can't remember. And there was a philosopher. So it was the four people, three scientists, a philosopher. And they were debating what this cosmology and what's nothing. And at the end of it, they asked the philosopher what he thought, because he was sort of quiet for the whole time. And he had this like dumbfounded look on his face. And he said, this is the weirdest conversation of my life. You've all spent the last half hour debating what nothing is. Nothing means not anything, right? And he couldn't wrap his head around why these guys were changing the meaning of the word nothing. But they have to, or else their science doesn't work, because they need like some starting material to get the universe going. It's the only way they can make sense of it. So it's a very circular kind of idea. They need stuff there to get the preconditions necessary to get the universe going, and then they just kind of slip in and call that nothing, okay? But again, all of this stuff, all of this dependence on, so M theory, okay, requires 11 dimensions for the math to work out, okay? So, I mean, now that's down from like 22 dimensions they used to need until they refined the theory, okay? They've got it down to 11. But still, like, there's no experimental data for this. There's nothing. And this is why, again, Roger Penrose calls it, it's faith and it's fantasy, right? It's not science. And he makes that, so if you're interested in kind of an atheist perspective on why this dependence on just fantastical, magical science is a bad idea, you can read this book. But the point being is that's the, again, only place people have to hang their hat on to disagree with this. Either they just misread it, or they just invent magic and call it science, right? In the name of quantum theory and M theory. Because again, they just don't like the conclusion, and it's so simple that there's nothing else for them to debate, okay? So, that's the Kalam cosmological argument with some cosmology and quantum mechanics thrown in the mix there. Any questions about any of that? Wait, what? Anything on the board? Quantum, cosmology, yeah. And it's funny, actually. So just over Christmas, I had a long conversation with my brother-in-law, who is very like atheist, like very passionate about his atheism. Okay, and it was very interesting because, I think telling. I mentioned before that it seems like when you're sort of talking with people, they have a lot of these beautiful whatabouts because they're looking for some excuse. Okay, because I was probing kind of some of the things he was saying, kind of getting to the bottom of it. And he said, well, I have no problem with the idea of God if he just made the universe and walked away. That's fine, right? He just doesn't like a God that's present, right? That he would ostensibly be accountable to. Do you see, like, when you start to really unpack what they're saying, you try to understand, like, as much as I love sort of apologetics and physics and stuff, it sometimes it's only effective if someone is really, they earnestly want to know, right? Because then you can really help them get past legitimate problems. For anyone for whom they're using it as sort of this crutch, we mentioned in this class, this excuse for an emotional reason, it probably won't help them, unfortunately, right? Because the problem is emotional, and they're just using this as an excuse. So anyway, we're kind of again talking, and he said, well, his answer to all this was, well, there's this, yeah, sure, yeah, before the universe, there's just some like multi-dimensional, non-physical, metaphysical quantum space, right? But now, like, again, to think of that, okay, so the idea of God is absurd, but multi-dimensional, non-physical, metaphysical quantum space, that's fine, right? That's fine, no problem. Like, I mean, again, right, like, Aquinas would just say, like, okay, you know what? Yeah, multi-dimensional, non-physical quantum space, and this thing we call God, right? So you can dress it up however you want. The point is, there's sort of this force that sort of defies the physical universe that needs to kind of get this thing going. Call it a 11-dimensional space if you need to, but basically we're saying the same thing. It's God. Okay. All right. Move on from the Kalam cosmological argument. Oh. Yeah. Well, there was, yeah, two premises and one conclusion. You know, most of them are kind of like, oh, here they go again. 'Cause we've had other conversations before, you know. And mostly they just said like, be quiet, the kids are sleeping. But they kind of just let us do our thing. So it was very cordial. It wasn't like a, you know, no, it was very, because the other thing too, you know, so it's funny. I remember there was oh, what was it now? Was it it might have been Sean McDowell. I think it might have been, I can't remember who now, the apologist, but he did this experiment where he went on stage at a Christian convention pretending to be an atheist. Okay, and he was arguing with the crowd about all the, you know, these ideas, you know, and the crowd got really riled up and hostile to him. And at the end, he said, like, look, hey, you know, hey, just, you know, take my hat off. You know, guess what? I'm a Christian, okay? I'm an apologist, but look at the way you're behaving, right? And people were like, oh, they kind of realized, like, yeah, they got really angry and heated, you know, in sort of defense of what they believe. And I remember, so years ago, I was helping with the high school youth here. And at the time, Casey, if anyone's around, you might remember Casey, he was the high school youth pastor here. And he did the same thing. So he even told people that's what he was doing. Of course, everyone knew who he was anyway, but he went up stage and said, I'm going to pretend to be an atheist and we're going to have a talk, right? So he was saying things and people would put their hands and kind of respond to what he was saying. And the students and even some of the leaders got really upset with him, even though they all know who he is, right? But again, I think it just shows us like that we sometimes have this tendency to like get really riled up. But again, it's kind of what I was saying before. It's like, you know, because it's the what about, it's the misdirection, it's the distraction. But if you just stay very calm and clear and step by step, I think you'll find that you have a lot better chance of success. And I think too, one thing I like about this class, at least personally, is I find that people's objections don't bother me anymore because I can see them for like how silly they are, right? Just speaking personally, it was when I didn't understand enough that I felt threatened in what I believe. That's when I started getting riled up, right? But now that I sort of know all this stuff, people have weird objections. It's almost funny. Like, I mean, it's not funny because like I'm really concerned about what they think as, you know, as a person that I want them to believe. But it's funny that, again, like multi-dimensional metaphysical space, like it's just, you know, it's not threatening to me to what I believe. It's just sort of a little bit funny. So yeah, something to think about. Okay. The next one, number 3, the fine tuning of the universe. Now this one you may have heard of. It's a little bit sort of more sort of in pop culture, I guess. Fine tuning of the universe, or something you may have sort of heard bandied about. And basically the idea is, again, along similar lines. So what we've come to see in science, especially over the last couple decades, is that there are certain fundamental quantities of the universe, that are so precise in their value that any small deviation would render the universe, I mean, nothing. Like the universe would collapse in on itself instantly. So there's about 22 or so fundamental constants of the universe. Okay, and the only reason I say or so is because some people say, well, that one's not a fundamental one. That one's sort of just, you know, derived from this other quantity. So there's some debate, but there's a lot anyway, you know, 19, 20, 20. And so these would be things like the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, you know, like the weight of an electron, weight charge of an electron. Okay, there's a whole bunch of them. You know, expansion rate of the universe. All these things, you know, have a very specific value to them. Okay, so you know the exact, you know, electric charge, the exact strength of this force. That if any one of these forces were the tiniest bit different, the universe never would have existed. It would have, like, again, if you sort of think cosmologically, it would have sort of like, you know, big bang, boom, it sort of created and instantaneously collapsed into nothing. Because the state of these forces would render any physical universe impossible. And they're so delicately, precisely balanced against each other that if you can imagine, like imagine this whiteboard. And I mean, every like microscopic dot of the whiteboard is a possible universe. Let's just say, you can imagine, I mean, how many, whatever, millions, billions of microscopic dots there are. Then like, maybe this one over here, teeny tiny speck, that one is maybe a valid configuration. Maybe this one over here, beep, tiny, that one's valid. And all this white are invalid possibilities for how the universe could have been constructed, okay? It wouldn't have worked. So that's really weird, right? That the universe would be so delicately balanced, and yet it is here. Well, what can explain that? What can explain the fact that the odds of the universe being existent at all are so low, and yet we're here? What explains it? Well, some scientists, so for example, Richard Dawkins I mentioned, he says, and so again, now I need to back up one thing. No one debates that the universe is fine-tuned. Atheists, they all agree the universe is fine-tuned. Okay, these values are precisely tuned against each other. No one doubts that. So I have to explain why it's not God. Okay, so Richard Dawkins says, well, sure, the universe appears to be fine-tuned, but we know it's not, and so therefore we just dismiss it, right? Which is, again, extremely circular logic, right? Sure. He does not debate the idea that it's fine-tuned. Oh, sure, it looks fine-tuned, but we know it's not. Well, why? He doesn't explain why we know that. He just concludes, yeah, we know it's not. Another sort of argument against, I'll kind of put it in a little box down here, just to show that it's like separate from like the point of it. People call it this sort of anthropic principle. Okay, this is sort of how they explain it. Anthropic principle. And what they say is, well, sure, the universe is fine-tuned, but that's what we should expect. Because if it wasn't fine-tuned, then we wouldn't be here. And therefore, we wouldn't be here to question and wonder why it's fine-tuned. So obviously, it had to be fine-tuned, or we wouldn't be here to question it, right? Which, like, it makes a degree of sense. Because sure, if the universe wasn't here, didn't exist, we wouldn't be here to wonder about the universe, okay? But nothing else do we really think of in these terms, right? Where the event, however unlikely, has in itself its own explanation, right? So let's say you won the lottery, but you didn't buy a ticket. Well, that's weird, right? How did you win the lottery? Well, you don't go, well, it's obvious that I won the lottery. If I didn't win the lottery, I wouldn't be here wondering how I won the lottery. No, you'd be like, there must be a reason. What is the reason? This very improbable event has occurred. What is the reason, right? It's not enough to just say it happened. The odds were low, but it happened, right? There's a reason, okay? So the anthropic principle is just not something we apply to anything else. There's a very, very weird way of thinking. But a couple things to think about even beyond that. So there's this idea in nature where everything follows the path of least resistance, right? And we see this sort of, in the physical. If you drop a ball on a hill, it'll kind of bounce, and find sort of that groove where it starts to roll down, right? It found the path of least resistance, it rolls down. We think of sort of the quantum configuration of molecules and atoms. The reason that electrons, sort of orbit an atom in the precise way they do is because they occupy the state that takes the least amount of energy to do so. Okay, because anything else is sort of a waste of energy. Okay, so nature sort of found an equilibrium. Okay, this is all through nature. So if it were possible for the universe to exist in a simpler form that wasn't so fine-tuned, then why doesn't it? Right? This, again, violates everything we see in nature in every other capacity. Right? Nature always finds this equilibrium of the sort of the simplest, lowest energy state form. But here we have a universe that's so improbably, delicately, precisely, complexly, yeah, balanced in a complicated way. It just doesn't make sense for it to be like that if there could have been a simpler way. If there was a way for the universe to be configured that wasn't fine-tuned, That's what we should expect. The fact that the universe is in this form should make us expect there was no other way the universe could have been. So this very improbable configuration is the only way. And so then we say, okay, well, was whatever force Big Bang caused it just really lucky? Or did it take a lot of tries to get it? So it made a universe, collapsed it. Yeah, it didn't work. I'll try again. I'll tweak the force. I'll try again. Well, now this is interesting because, of course, if the force has no will, it can't decide, I'm going to tweak this force, tweak this, see what happens, okay? But also think of it. If the universe, so it does creates it, it collapses into nothing, there's nothing existence. If the force were to make it again, why would the values be different? Again, it cannot choose for them to be different. So how would it make different values to try all different combinations? I don't see how it could, right? So even if you were to say, well, sure, the universe is fine-tuned, but given an infinite amount of time, it would have been developed randomly by random chance. I don't see how that argument is valid, because that basically implies that someone is able to keep trying new values. And I just don't see how that could be true, right? Again, without someone having the will to say, nah, it didn't work, let me try again, right? So again, whether you look at it from an idea of sort of this path of least resistance, we shouldn't expect a universe like this, but we have it. If you look at it from, well, maybe the universe, you just took, a million, billion, trillion tries to get it going. I don't see how that is possible. Okay. If you look at it from the anthropic principle, well, again, that's, something existing does not explain its own cause, right? There's a reason. And again, so I'll send you as a video. There's a really interesting video that someone made about this. And one thing it says is, like, if you take a dice, and roll it and get a 6, what are the odds of that? Well, 1 in 6, right? If you roll it 1,000 times and it gets 6 every time, well, the odds are pretty small of that happening. And would you conclude, oh, that was weird? Or would you conclude that this dice is rigged, right? And the odds of any one of these forces, these values, being what they are, is so astronomically tiny. But the odds of them all being like that and balanced against each other is an incomprehensibly small number. Like, it would, 0.00000, add like 1,000 trillion zeros, like, you can't even fathom the odds of this. It's just incalculably small. But again, so are we thinking then, we got lucky, or would you think, like, it's rigged? The game is rigged, right? So I'll send you a video that goes over that. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, fine-tuning of the universe. And again, right, this is actually one of the more modern arguments for the existence of God, because obviously now we have sort of science advanced to the point where we can analyze these forces. Of course, people didn't have that even 100 years ago. So again, another example of what I mean by science demonstrating the need for God, not the other way around. And interestingly, I write his name on the board. There was a philosopher. His name was Antony Flew. And he was a very, very strong atheist. Antony Flew. And he debated Christians all around the world for decades. Near the end of his life, he believed from the scientific evidence like this, that there had to be some God. He didn't say he was the God of the Bible, Christianity, but he became a deist, right? He believed in some deity, okay? Not because of emotional reasons, okay? Not because of, he was a philosopher, not even because of philosophical reasons, because of scientific evidence of things like this. The fine-tuning of the universe convinced him. He said, science has shown us, and over the decades of his life and his work, philosophical work, science had advanced to the point where he said, like, there must have been a God that created this. Okay, so again, this idea that science is not disproving God, it's constantly reinforcing the idea that we need God. And so again, I sort of mentioned last week, like, did Jesus and his disciples walk around contemplating the weak nuclear force? No, it's now that we have the benefit of this. So 2,000 years later, we have so many more reasons to believe in God that it's such a blessing, right? Okay, let's see what time it is. Okay, half an hour. Any questions about the fine-tuning of the universe? Yeah, okay. I'm going to just talk about something somewhat related then, since I kind of alluded to it a little bit. And this one, I've sort of contemplated on my own, so it doesn't have such a fancy name as like the 5 ways of Aquinas. Right now, I kind of just call it the nature of forces. And so, if we think about how forces work, how machines work, if you have like a bandsaw or any kind of saw, right, and it's like, okay, you know it's going, and you press wood up against it, the wood will be cut, right? The wood cannot not be cut. It will be cut. It's not like you press it up against the wood and the saw is going, and the wood just kind of sits there for a while until the saw decides, yeah, okay, now is fine. I'll start cutting now, right? No. When we say I'll write that, okay? When the conditions are sufficient for a force to act, right, it is necessary that it will act. That it will act, okay? So when the conditions are sufficient, then it is necessary that it will act, okay, right? So again, if I hold the pen up and I drop it, gravity doesn't just decide when it'll pull the pen, right? It drops immediately. When the wood is up against the saw, it is cut immediately. It does not decide when to act. When the conditions are sufficient, it is necessary that it will act. So let's think about this. There's a force that is capable of bringing the universe into existence. Whether you believe, again, that it's some multidimensional metaphysical quantum force or God, doesn't really matter. Some force is capable of bringing a universe into existence, right? Now, the universe, we've already said, is not infinite in time. There is a moment in time when it began. So what was the force waiting for, right? It was capable of bringing the universe into existence from nothing or from whatever it had, and yet it didn't, right? So, well, that doesn't sound like a force at all, right? That sounds like a person, a being with a will, right? Because if the force, or if there was a mindless force that has always existed, right? Whose existence is necessary, that we saw from Aquinas, then the universe should be infinite. Now, it would still be contingent, right? Because it's causally dependent on the force, okay? But it's still infinite in its temporal existence, if that makes any sense, okay? So it has always existed. But that's not true, right? So, yeah, are you sort of seeing what I mean there, right? If the force has the capability of bringing a universe into existence, then why did it not do so immediately? It waited for a moment in time. And that's not how forces act. That's how beings with will act. And that's kind of the end of that one, right? So I think we can conclude this force has a will. It's not just powerful. It's not just self-existent, right? It has a will. And this, I think, is the first, well, and the fine-tuning, right? The fine-tuning argument shows that, again, so if there was just a mindless force, again, so it makes the universe and it doesn't work and it collapses, well, the conditions are now still the same, right? We have nothing. So why would it make something different, right? Again, to think of a force. If you place the same block of wood up against the saw twice, does it cut the same way or different way? Same, right? It cannot choose how to cut it, right? It is deterministic. Right? If I drop the pen, it doesn't, drop one way one time, and the next time it just starts to fly up in the air for a second. Oops, something like that. Okay. It falls the same way every time. Right? Forces are deterministic. So if the universe, or the force creates the universe deterministically, and then it collapses on itself, it would then make it again deterministically, meaning essentially the same way, right? Because the starting conditions are the same. There's nothing. So starting conditions are the same, end result is the same. This is what I mean. The universe, it wouldn't be able to produce new universes to find one that works. It would make the same universe over and over and fail to do so for infinity, right? So again, we see, I think, that this force needs to have a will, and it needs to be able to sort of choose. I will make this kind of universe, and I will make it now. And that's not how forces act. So I think we've sort of added a few more characteristics to our force that we call God. Any questions about?
I want to reset. So that's Ryan's principle, Ryan's theory.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
Well, that could last forever.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, but I think it's pretty compelling. So yeah.
It's correct to say that the beginning
Mhm. Mhm.
something that the universe is guided to
Mhm.
and that is repeating that Kalam's ways
Mhm.
and God's overall to say that.
I mean, if you want to say something like, yeah, the universe, some people will say, right, that, okay, there's the Big Bang and what they call the Big Crunch, where it all comes back together. And then there's another Big Bang and a Big Crunch, right? And so they say that in this way, the universe is sort of infinite, or at least infinitely cycling. And now we could say, well, sure, can God do that? Yes, God could do anything he wants. He wants to make an infinitely cycling universe. But I don't think you can conclude that that could happen without God, because you would need some ability to explain why we are not experiencing, like the heat death of the universe, like why entropy has not constantly increased, and there are sort of other problems along there. But could God have made the laws of the universe? Sure. Yeah, God can do anything he wants. So, again, God as this force that operates outside of the physical reality can influence the physical reality in ways that defy the sort of the laws of physics as we understand them. So yes, God can set up any principle. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Or are you still?
Well, my question was actually,
Mm.
I was debating with somebody
Mhm.
years ago.
Mhm.
We were talking about saying that God put some laws, put some rules, put some
Mhm.
things in the universe,
Uh-huh.
the gravity, or some constants, and it's guided.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the question was, okay, so that was done in the beginning, so God has no intervention about any of these things because they are happening
Mhm.
anyway,
Mhm.
based on the initial law.
Mhm.
So, but God is still present,
Mhm.
and He can influence one way or the other
Mhm.
the existence of the universe.
Mhm.
And that was the argument.
Right. Yeah, right. So this would sort of be, some of the argument between like evolution and creationism, right? Did God in the beginning institute the laws of the universe that, according to these laws, gave rise to humanity? Maybe. Did God directly intervene, sort of in the sort of poetic way of the Bible, and swirl dust and make? Maybe. We don't really know, but certainly I think the point to take from this is that no matter which way you look at it, we find the necessity of God. So whether you want to say that God directly intervened in a miraculous fashion, obviously that very clearly shows the need for God.
The Bible says, the sun is,
Mhm.
it's following the course.
Mhm.
It's a day.
Yeah.
Mhm. Going around the sun and so on and so on.
Mhm.
But at one point in time in history, the sun was, was stopped.
Mhm.
So when was that the battle?
For the battle, yeah.
So that was a miracle
Mhm.
intervention of God.
Mhm. You're right. Sure.
So that could be possible because God can intervene.
Yes.
Do some things that doesn't make sense to the law.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I do think obviously, yeah, God did, set up these very, very complex and delicately balanced laws that we saw, right? These different forces. And I think, one important thing to draw from that, I think, too, is like, so we think back to, let me get the actual quote here for you, because I think this is going to be relevant. If we're all familiar with Augustine, of course, was a very famous person in the sort of the history of the church. Okay, here's what Augustine said. Sort of when we're thinking about the these scientific ideas in God, right? This is what Augustine wrote. He said, usually even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens. And by heavens, he meant like space, right? And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. If they find a Christian mistaken in a field which they themselves know well and hear him maintaining his foolish opinions about our books, how are they going to believe those books in matters concerning the resurrection of the dead, the hope of eternal life, and the kingdom of heaven, when they think that their pages are full of falsehoods and on facts which they themselves have learned from experience and the light of reason? So what he's saying basically is we're talking to people about these ideas about, the sun going around, or the earth orbiting the sun, or this and that, and the various physical things, right? We should be very, very careful to, or what we are ascribing to, direct intervention by God or not, okay? So again, the evolution one is a good example. So if we tell someone, look, evolution is all wrong, okay? So you're wrong, all your evidence is wrong, and by the way, you should believe this Bible. They may disbelieve the Bible because they disbelieve your opinion of biology, right? And I kind of want to mention last week, the opinion about biology is not the important part of it, right? And who knows what God did way back when? Like, we don't really know, okay? And it also doesn't matter, right? So rather than give an opinion about biology and maybe be wrong, we could just give the opinion about the Bible, and that's the important part anyway, right? So I know that's not maybe like directly related to kind of what you're saying, but this idea that God can do anything. I think God has set up these rules. I'll give you one other quote as well. This is from John Lennox, who's a mathematician and apologist. He's still alive, teaching at Oxford, I believe, in the UK. So he says, the take-home message from Augustine is, if my views on something not fundamental to the gospel, on which equally convinced Christians disagree, attract ridicule, and therefore disincline my hearers to listen to anything I have to say about the Christian message, then I should be prepared to entertain the possibility that it might be my interpretation that is at fault. And he goes further and says, in connection with the motion of the earth, we accept Augustine's advice because we can now see, although the Bible text could be understood to support a fixed earth, which is sort of what people use to argue that passage, right? They say, well, of course the sun can stand still in the sky because the earth is fixed, right? And the sun revolves on the earth, like these kind of things, right? So although the Bible text could be understood in that way, there is a reasonable alternative interpretation of those texts that makes far more sense in light of our greater understanding of how the solar system operates. We now know that the earth does not rest on literal foundation or pillars made of stone, concrete, or steel. And we can therefore see that the words foundations and pillar in the Bible are used in a metaphorical sense. But this kind of what you're saying about God instituting these kind of rules of the universe, right? He says, however, it needs to be emphasized once more that the metaphors stand for realities. God, the creator, has built certain very real stabilities into the planetary system that will guarantee its existence so long as it's necessary to fulfill his purposes. Science has been able to show us that the Earth is stable in its orbit over long periods of time, thanks in part to the obedience of gravity, to an inverse square law, to the presence of the moon, which stabilizes the tilt of Earth's axis, and to the existence of the giant planet Jupiter, which helps keep the other planets in the same orbital plane. Earth's stability, therefore, is very real. It is, if you wish, a literal or true stability, even though it does not now make sense to understand the word stability literalistically as referring to motionlessness. But there's something more. We accept the metaphorical interpretation because we can see that it is a perfectly sensible and informed understanding of the biblical text. The earth does not have to be at the center of the physical universe in order to be at the center of God's attention. So even though our interpretation relies on scientific knowledge, it does not compromise the authority of Scripture. And this is the important point. So what they're basically saying, Augustine and John Lennox are saying, is like, kind of what you're saying, God did create these rules about how the universe operates. And when we are thinking about the Bible and what it says, like we just need to be a little bit careful in terms of how we view God's interaction on things, right? And so when God says, the earth is, rests on pillars of stone. Well, does the earth really rest on pillars of stone, or is God talking? Is it talking like John Lennox is saying about these physical laws God has instituted, which gives the earth stability? I mean, I don't know, but I think the point is we see through all these arguments that we need a God of will and intelligence to put all this together. That the idea of it coming about by accident, by random chance, by an unintelligible, will-less force is nonsense, right? So we know we need God, and that's the crux of it. And then the exact interpretation of how things go in the Bible in terms of like how much is God directly intervening, how much is sort of metaphorical, poetic understanding of science. I think we just be a little bit careful because, again, kind of like Augustine and John Lennox are saying, we don't want to turn someone away from the message of the gospel, which is the important part, by our message of the motion of earth, which is the unimportant part. So I think that was probably a fair bit far afield from what your original kind of point and question was. But I felt it was sort of on the track that might be worth mentioning. Does that say anything relevant to what you're, yeah? Okay, all right. Any other questions about anything that I was mentioning there? How much time do? Oh yeah, John Lennox has it. Yes, his good Irish accent. Yeah, cannot do that. Okay, I'll do one last one here. We have 10 minutes left, and so we will look at the argument from morality. Okay, so this is again, this is going away from math and science and quantum mechanics. Okay, argument from morality. From morality. And this is going to look very similar actually to the Kalam cosmological argument. If absolute morality exists, then there is a God. Two, absolute morality does exist. And then again, in our conclusion of sort of our syllogistic structure, our syllogism here, there is a God. And again, I'll put the sort of notational logic on the side. So if absolute morality exists, then there's a God. Absolute morality does exist. God, okay? Again, very, very simple. So again, hopefully this logical form makes sense to you. And again, the logic, again, is what we call valid. It did not break any rules of logic to get from here to here. Okay. Now the question, though, is the logic sound? Right? Does that mean that the assumptions are true? Well, let's think about this. If you present this to someone, a skeptic, atheist, what have you, obviously they're not going to agree with the conclusion. So they must disagree with at least one of these two. What I found is that usually a person will agree with one of them and not the other, typically. Okay. So, for example, the very strict naturalist, right, believing that the natural world is all there is, okay, will actually believe this one, right? Because they don't believe in absolute morality, but they concede that if there were such a thing, then of course it must have come from God, because there's no naturalist explanation for it. But they don't believe it. They just don't believe it exists anyway. So fine. The other kind of person is maybe someone who doesn't really look at the world in terms of this naturalist, sort of deterministic sense. And maybe this kind of person is very concerned with ideas of like, social welfare and social justice. And they do believe very strongly that absolute morality exists, right? They're very concerned about it. But of course, now they can't believe this premise, because if they believe this one, then the conclusion follows logically. So by default, they have to just believe this. They believe that absolute morality does exist, but it did not proceed from God. Okay. So let's look at this top one first. Think about this. So I mentioned, last week that I'm a video game developer. let's imagine that, so I went on my computer and I program my game, whatever it is, and then I'm done with that computer. I, leave it in the basement. It's plugged in or whatever for some reason. And over the years, it collects dust in the hard drive. And then wouldn't you know it, over however many years, it produced a game by itself, a world and characters and environments, okay? And you might think to yourself, that's bizarre. That's incredible. How could that happen? I say, yeah, I know, but check this out. Not only did this computer in the basement produce a game, a world, intelligence, it produced absolute morality. And you would think that's very, very strange. And why would you think that's strange? Because if it produced absolute morality, that means that the morals of this game apply to us outside the game. And in fact, they applied before that game ever came into existence. And if I were to turn that computer off, the morals would still apply to us. But that's absurd, right? But that's the state of our universe, right? If someone believes absolute morality exists, well, how did it come about? Did we stumble upon it now in this century? And just, by strange happenstance, it actually applied timelessly in the past and to the rest of the universe as well? Did the Big Bang spew forth morals when the universe began? I don't see how, right? But now this is the problem. But if someone believes absolute morality exists, that means the morals apply absolutely, universally, in all time and space. And I think people often don't understand what they mean, right? When they say something is right or wrong, what they usually mean is something like, well, it's, the law of this jurisdiction, or it seems useful to society at this moment in time in this particular culture, okay? But these are just laws, right? We have another name for that. It's called a law, or maybe a cultural norm, right? But if absolute morality exists, that means, if you look at, China has very different societal structures than we do, right? That either they are right or we are right, or neither of us are right, but it cannot be that both of us are right, okay? But so this type of person will basically just say absolute morality, but they don't really understand what it is they're saying. If absolute morality, right and wrong, separate from societal culture, from law, if that really does exist, you must say it applies timelessly and spacelessly. So it doesn't make sense for us to say, well, now, we know what's morally right now in this time. And it, people back, centuries ago, they were all fools living amorally, right? C.S. Lewis often calls this chronological snobbery, right? That we in this time, we are so enlightened and everyone else was just barbarians, okay? And apparently everyone in the future is also barbarians because, again, they're going to think different things than we do, but we know we're right, okay? Well, that's not how we really conceive of this absolute morality to be. It transcends this moment, right? So there's just no explanation for how this morality got here, if they really believe it, right? So hopefully we can see that one is sort of defeated. Any questions about how I went about that? All good. Okay, the one last one to finish the night then. So the strict naturalist will say, yeah, fine, this is true, because they don't believe in absolute morality. But if it were to exist, then fine, God made it, whatever. Because there's no, again, kind of what we just said, there's no natural process by which we can explain it. The Big Bang did not spew forth morals, right? So here's the thing. C.S. Lewis called this worldview unlivable. The idea that there's no such thing as absolute morality. And let's think of some examples. If I go to international waters, there's no laws there. You can do anything you want. So I bring my family out there and a storm hits and we're far from land and I can't get back to the sea and I'm hungry, I could eat my daughter and my son and my wife, but I mean, and that's fine, right? No one has a problem with that. Well, except everyone would have a problem with that, right? No one would say, yeah, your little 2-year-old cute little boy, eat him, right? Survival of the fittest. I'm fitter. I can eat them. I need strength to get back to shore, right? No one would think that's okay. But why? It has to be okay if there's no such thing as absolute morality, because there's no law applying to me. And if I don't eat my son, I will die. Okay, it's a matter of survival. Think of another example. We think back to World War II. the Nazis were performing horrible experiments in the name of eugenics, the perfection of the human genome, right? They're trying to figure out how to perfect the human race through these horrible experiments called eugenics. Richard Dawkins, who I mentioned a couple of times, has said, okay, eugenics works, but heaven forbid we should do it. But, hold on, what are you appealing to there? Is heaven forbid, was it? Because, and hold on. Okay, so we're all just meaningless bundles of random atoms that smash together to form a human. Why shouldn't we perfect the human race? Right? Survival of the fittest. We want to have the highest chance of our culture, our species propagating. Why wouldn't we perfect it? Right? There's no moral reason why, right? So why shouldn't we? But what Richard Dawkins knows, if he goes on Twitter and says, yeah, eugenics works, let's do it, he'll be just like, destroyed and his book sales will plummet, right? So you can't say that. And people have said that in private conversations with him, which I have not talked to him, if they kind of get him up against the wall on this issue, he'll kind of hum and haw and be like, well, yeah, I guess, murder and everything is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Because he has to conclude that. Because or else his worldview doesn't make sense, right? If absolute morality doesn't exist, then eugenics is an awesome idea. It's an amazing idea. Because then we'll all benefit, and our descendants will all benefit, because the human race will be purified from like my horrible eyesight and everything else, right? And we'll all be better off. But no one thinks that. It's like C.S. Lewis said, this worldview is unlivable, right? You can't do it. I had a pastor, I used to go to Broadway Church when I lived in Vancouver, and the pastor there said, if this is true, then the only person who's actually living according to reality is the sociopath. Because they do whatever they want with no remorse. That is reality then. All of us who are pretending like there's some sort of rules in place, and good and bad and right and wrong, are deluding ourselves. Right? The sociopath is the only rational person. But again, no one thinks that, right? So that worldview is unlivable. So no matter which way you approach this, you either have to show how the Big Bang spewed forth morality, or you have to conclude that eugenics is amazing. And and again, you'll get pushback. Someone will say like, well, we should do what's good for the highest number of people, kind of this utilitarian idea, right? And so I talked to my brother-in-law again over Christmas, and I said, yes, but if someone doesn't do that, are they wrong? And he said, well, you could quantify scientifically, how the effect on society. And I said, yes, but are they wrong? Right? And that's the issue, right? Because you may say utilitarianism is right, but am I wrong for saying it's not? Right? And again, you keep coming back to this core issue that if you're talking about absolute morality, absolute right and wrong, then it really has this implication of God that's inescapable. And this is the argument for morality. Any questions about that? All good. Well, we blitzed through, I think, like 6 or so of the 9 arguments tonight. Hopefully it didn't go too fast. Again, I'll send out the video, and we can go over the remaining ones next class. But for tonight, why don't I pray, and we'll finish up then. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, for this evening, where we can gather to understand our reality, God, from a philosophical perspective, mathematical, scientific, God. And no matter which way we look at our reality, we come to find you. And we come to find these attributes of you that are inescapable, of power and will and knowledge and intelligence and self-existence, and on, God. And it's just so amazing, God. I just really praise you just for who you are. But of course, again, we must always keep in mind, Lord, that it's not just that you are powerful and self-existent, but that you love us and that you saved us by your Son, God. And so we just thank you so much for that. Thank you for everyone who participates in this class. I pray that it would be a blessing to them and to everyone that they come in contact with, everyone that they have discussions with, that your name would be glorified and people's hearts would turn to you. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thank you guys so much. See you again for more arguments for the existence of God.